Today we want to cover a subject that it's not covered a whole lot. It's actually deals with child sexual abuse involving males. And through this, we have hope for the abused and victory for the victim is what we're looking for. So what is sexual abuse? Sexual abuse, it's any sexual activity between adults and minors or between two minors when one forces it upon the other. This can include sexual touching, non-touching acts such as exhibitionism, exposure to pornography, photograph of a child for sexual gratification, solicitation of a child for prostitution, voyeurism, and communication in a sexual ways by phone, internet, or face-to-face. And with that, our society has become what it has become today with Facebook and many of the apps, Snapchat being one of those apps also, used for various purposes. So some of these things you may not have been aware of before, but it's a open door for children to be exploited through. But this sexual abuse also doesn't refer only to sexual touching. But if you were forced as a child to watch sexual activity or pornography, this is also a form of sexual abuse. If an adult continued to invade your privacy by trying to watch you a shower, taking a shower, sexual comments about your body, this is actually another form of sexual abuse. So for some people, this might stretch some of their beliefs and thought processes to what they thought sexual abuse was before, but it is on many different levels. And sexual abuse of boys is very common. It's underreported and underrecognized. It's also undertreated. There is also evidence to suggest that 1 in every 3 incidents of a child's sexual abuse is not remembered by the adult who experienced it. And the younger the child was at the time of that abuse, the closer the relationship to the abuser, and that child will not be able to recall the event. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to let Blake actually give some of his testimony in his life. And go ahead, Blake.
Well, to start, to know where I am at today, you have to know where I've been and what I've been through. And at 6 years old, I was sexually abused for a period of time, multiple times. And looking back on it as a child, I didn't know when it happened. As a child, and with the innocence, you have no idea that what's being done is wrong, and to a degree you think it's normal. It's a normalized thing. Everybody goes through it. But as I began to grow in age, I realized that the things that had happened were not normal and were not okay. And I began to just bury that trauma deep within my mind. I just buried it, ignored it, and subconsciously, over the years, it began to drive fuel and addiction to multiple drugs, alcohol, pornography, very depraved behavior. And through my teenage years, it was something that I don't even, looking back, recall thinking about. Not even a single time I'd buried it so deep. But looking back now, I can tell that the subconscious effects of it are what drove me to do the things that I did. I met my wife when we started dating when we were 16 years old, and I hadn't even told her about it. And I remember we went back and forth throughout our years where I would get sober, I would get back on drugs and alcohol, I would get sober. It was just a constant cycle. And there was one night that she came in the living room in the middle of the night, and I was just sitting in a recliner in the complete dark drinking moonshine, and she just asked, she said, why do you do this? And I just looked at her and told her, it all came out that night. I said I was sexually abused as a child, I don't know why I do this, but it had become a part of my life. I was so consumed by addiction that everything I did revolved around getting drunk, getting high, staying that way. And it wasn't until a few years later, I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but the things that happened that I experienced led me to believe that there was no God throughout my childhood, because I know it's a common thing amongst people that have been abused is, if there is this omnipotent God who loves everybody and he's a miracle worker, why in the world would he not step in when I was being abused? And I believe that's just more influence from the devil, keeping you grounded in your past, not looking for the future, because we'll never have the answers of why God did or didn't do something, but we know what he wants to do with us. And anyways, I got to a point in my life where I was strung out on meth. I had a newborn baby. My son was 3 or 4 years old. I'd come to a point, my wife said she could no longer do it. I was very suicidal. It wound up, it brought me to a place where I had nowhere to go. I knew treatment wasn't an option. It wasn't something I needed. I'd been in and out of rehabs, and to no avail. Every time I wound up back using drugs. But my wife had been going to church for about 3 years when I came to a point. She said it was either treatment or she had to divorce me, because she couldn't raise our kids in that lifestyle any longer. And out of manipulation, I had told her, if you'll meet with your pastor and see if he'll pray with us before I go to treatment, then I'm willing to go. And it was only out of the mind of trying to buy myself some more time so I could figure out how to keep my drugs and keep my family. And he agreed to meet with us and pray. And when I went into that church that night, there were 3 men. I sat down. I told them about what I'd been through, and they led me through a series of prayers and down a road just of forgiving those who had abused me, who I'd felt like done me wrong. And I think there's a big misconception with forgiveness, that forgiveness is by forgiving those people, you're saying what they did do was all right, and that's a misconception, because forgiveness it frees you from them. It says, I'm no longer being bound by what you did to me. It doesn't make things okay. It doesn't say that was okay and we can be best friends from here on out. But what it does is it frees you. And that night I became free from everything in my past that had ever happened to me, the people that have affected me. And before we got up to leave that night, after I'd said the salvation prayer, nothing really felt different about myself. But before we got up to leave, the pastor asked, he said, there's one more thing I would like to do with you, if you're okay with it. And I was like, okay, what is that? And he said, I'd like to seal your salvation with baptism in the Holy Spirit. And I kind of rolled my eyes, and I thought, that was when I said my first prayer in my head. I said, God, if you're real, you take these drugs from me and I'll serve you the rest of my life. And he never laid a hand on me. He began to pray. I don't know the prayer that he prayed, but I just know when he began to speak that it was like a lightning bolt hit me on the top of my head, and the electricity went through my body from my head to my toes. I fell out on the floor, and I got up out of that carpet a changed man and free from everything that I'd ever been through. And I lived a very dark life, and at one time I just remembered thinking my best option for my children and my wife was to kill myself so they didn't have to continue to endure the pain that I was putting them through, and that my kids were young enough that my wife could find another man that could raise them and be the father to them that they needed. And by God's grace, God's done a lot of great things in my life over the course of the past 5 years. We're successful business owners, but if the only thing I got out of being free that night was the work that's been done in our marriage and the work that's been done for me being a father to my children, the father that I'm called to be, that was all worth it. But throughout the dark times, I went through times where, looking back, a lot of the behavior that I was going through, like 12, 13 years old, the negative behavior, I was doing everything I could to prove to what I thought was everybody else that I was a man, because sexual abuse to a boy, to me, it made me, question my sexuality. What did I do to deserve it? Is this who I am? And I'm not man enough. This happened to me, so I'm not the man that I should be. And throughout my life, I got very violent, trying to prove that I was a man, and seeking validation from my peers. And I'm at a point right now that God's brought me to a point where I don't have to seek validation from anybody. It doesn't matter the opinion of anybody else. I'm not ashamed to talk about it. I thought before it was something I would never speak to anybody other than my wife, and now I can stand on a platform and tell the world, because there is no shame in what happened, so sorry.
And I think out of that night too, one of the things that you said that you had actually felt was joy. For the first time in your life, you had never felt joy that you remember up until that night that you had got saved, and God had delivered you from that. And not only from that, when as you were addicted at that time, you had been under the influence for quite some time, and then to wake up actually free from that the next day with no withdrawals, going into your drug abuse that you had been doing also. So
yes, it was. I was on medication for bipolar disorder, ADHD, schizophrenia, antidepressants. I'd been said to have PTSD. I heard voices, one voice in particular that would tell me to do crazy things, and from that prayer he prayed over me, from that point forward, I never heard another voice. I never went another night without sleep. I went right home that night. I went to sleep. I ate for the first time in a long time, and it was true freedom. And I think that's one thing we struggle with as a culture, is especially today with the things going on. We feel that, the freedom that I have, that others, I don't believe it's exclusive to me, but when you follow Christ, I don't have the pressure of, I don't have to bow to society's pressures of what's going on. I don't have to worry about, as said before, the validation of my peers. We live in a society where, with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, where likes have become a currency, views have become a currency, and they validate us. And, it's one thing that I'm free from. It's
it
amazing.
Wasn't free from just the trauma, but free from everything in your life that had kept you bound. And even with this, the reason why a lot of the public is not aware today of the sexual abuse of the problem the way it is, because statistics say that 73% of the victims don't tell anybody about what has happened for at least a year. Another 45%, and there's what it's saying, don't tell anybody for 5 years. And some never disclose what has happened to them at that point in time. But just to give people an idea of what we're dealing with when we talk about sexual abuse among boys and young men is the figures that they have, the statistics that they're supporting is 1 in 6 are going to be abused sexually before they turn 18. And I think that number, whether it was 1 in 100, is one too many. We have a focus as a society, as things have come up in the recent years here, about the hashtag Me Too movement, where the women are coming forward and saying Me Too. And I know in some of my notes here, I have several years ago, people know Tyler Perry, and they know what he's been on the screen for a long time. Well, he came out and told about the horrific abuse that he was abused by as a child. A couple other sports stars from what I was reading, but it seems very, very small in the professional sports community and the Hollywood community as far as someone actually coming forward and say, I was abused, it happened to me, being a spokesperson for that field and for those children and giving them hope too that you don't have to deal with that. There is freedom for you too, support groups. A lot of reasons though why children don't tell is they don't understand that they have been actually abused. They don't understand their mind and their processing. They can't figure that out.
And I think that goes back to where I was. It was like, I didn't tell anyone that it had happened. I didn't necessarily know it was wrong, but I knew it wasn't something I was supposed to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess in a sense, like, it's wrong, but it's just the way the cognitive, a child's cognitive skill set is far different than adults.
And that's where they're getting in here too, is the shame, the feelings of shame and guilt. Even as a child, when there's something is wrong, that you feel that, and it's just this overwhelming sense that a child is not prepared to deal with. Fear of consequences, depending on who that is. I think they say 90% of the people that have been abused, they know their abuser on a personal level, that they know their abuser. That's what's very important right now. People don't understand. We're focused on the pandemic, the mask or not mask, all this going on. A lot of the abuse actually happens in the child's home. So now they may have, the child may come from a broken home, and maybe the mother or the father has not even a step parent in there, but someone that they're seeing. And now that child is home continually. That parent may have to work, and the other person in the house isn't working, so now they have access completely full time. People think that these are also 40, 50, 60-year-old people, things like that. Almost half of all the numbers, a child is abused by another child. Could be brother and sister, something like that. It could be someone incest in the family. But these are not all done by adults. So now with the pandemic, people not being able to go to school, being away from the abuse, the physical abuse, mental abuse, all these things that can go on in a broken home. Now these children are locked up in a house 24 hours a day. They have nowhere to go. So the psychological effect on them, it has to be horrific. You talked about some of the things that you experienced down the road. If you thought about that, would have you been through that process if you hadn't experienced the abuse, do you think?
I don't. I've gone back and forth over that for years, and it's hard to say, really. I don't think so. Not only was I sexually abused, I was physically abused, along with mental and emotional abuse from my father, and I constantly battled with self-worth, not feeling good enough, feeling as I was a burden to everybody, and which turns to, it ends up being playing the blame game. As I got older, I was always the victim, had a victim mentality, and everything was everybody else's fault. And the things that happened to me were an influence on the way that I was, but had I reached out, and it was things I could have worked through, that I could have skipped dragging my knuckles through hell for 15 years.
Mm-hmm. And you had, I know that you spent a lot of time just continually moving, almost like you were trying to escape something too. I mean, you were East Coast, West Coast, Upper. I mean, it seemed like there was no place that you hadn't wandered at one time.
I was a drifter, and it was the constant running from who I was, seeking validation. There was this period of time where I felt as though I needed to work towards being famous, and again, that's seeking the validation of other people, thinking if I was famous, I would be validated by others, and it was just another lie from the devil. I was chasing something, running from something that was following me everywhere. I was the problem. I couldn't outrun myself. So everywhere I went, the problems followed me.
As we were talking, like I said, almost 50% in there. People are abused by other children. And some of the things, when you interview these people and someone that they were looking for to be able to abuse, because many have a type, but what they say is they're looking for a passive, a quiet, a troubled, a lonely child, possibly from a single parent or a broken home. In something like that case, a parent is going to be out a lot. A single home, parent home, sometimes they're working, mothers are working 2 jobs. I know when I met my wife, she was working 2 40-hour-a-week jobs when I had met her originally, just trying to survive with her and her kids. So it is something that is difficult to leave children sometimes with someone that you trust or believe that you trust. There's just so much out there anymore. Someone seems like trying to take advantage of something. But in there too, that children who are actually very particularly trusting, and they work to try and establish a relationship with them first, to gain their trust, to be able to abuse them, to keep that quiet, so they won't. Like I said, for a child, 3, 4, 5 years old, trying to figure out, how to process that. Okay, so even a child that's 5 years old that's being abused, now it maybe has a new baby in the home. Well, they've been abused for 2 or 3 years, and they equate this to somebody telling them, I love you, as you're abusing them. So now the next thing you know, that little 5-year-old child is abusing their younger sibling, thinking, I love my brother, love my sister, and they're doing what they think is normal, but they can't process that. It's not their fault.
We live in the society, culture nowadays, cell phones. We've got it in our pocket. Kids have cell phones and the ability to access pornography, by the movement of their thumb, and they watch that, and then, like you said, it carries over to a sibling. The garbage that's on TV, the shows we watch, they're loaded with subliminal, messages and images that provoke those. That everything around our culture is driven by sex.
Yes.
Everything. Because it sells, and it's, the devil is not God's equal opposite. The devil is a copycat. He can't create anything. He can only pervert what's been created. So the greatest gift that God has given us is man. One of the greatest gifts is man and wife, becoming one with your wife. The gift of sex has been perverted and just, drugged down to.
There's no limit anymore.
It's by the age of 18, most teenagers have had multiple sex partners.
And I know one of the videos I was watching the other day, and they were talking about numbers, and that they believe it's 20 to 50 million images of child pornography a day go across the internet. And just to think about that, and when I said the 1 in 6 number before, okay, so there's 150 million males basically in the United States. So when you put that into a number, 1 in 6, that's 25 million children, just by using that figure alone. So between 1 and 18, how many children come into the world? And you just think about that. Yeah, and those are the reported cases. So if one of the figures I have is 1 in 10 children will actually report the crime. So if you think about it that way, or the ones that forget, 25 million is a drop. I mean, it's nothing compared to what the actual real number is. And a lot of the kids too, it talks about that abuse other kids or reacting physical, sexual, emotional abuse experience of their own. It's the only way they know how to work against that. And you talked about the cognitive capabilities, the mind, that the mind of a child is always continually being processed up until it reaches, puberty, basically, I think, and then goes off into adulthood there. So the twisting, I don't know how many people that I've talked to here through the ministry, and that's the thing too here, guys, I forgot to put that up in the beginning. We do have a line up right now, a number that's on the screen there. If you text, if you have questions, if you would like to come in, we will have an 800 number here for some other people at the end of the program. But if you have something that you're dealing with yourself and have dealt with in the past, and you want to just sit and talk with someone and be free, there is a number there that you could text. You could come in. Any of us would be glad to help walk with you through the process, because it is a process for some. I mean, I said, Blake, it was 20 years almost before you had finally got 3, when it had actually finally come to a head and come out and you realized what was going on. It was 20 years. Or some of you maybe it just happened last week that you know someone that was abused, or you were abused yourself and you want to talk to someone. We'd be glad to work with you. Some people, they get into, like you were talking also about trying to figure out how they brought this upon. They think that they did something wrong, that they brought it upon themselves, and that guilt and that shame sets in, and it's just a spiral. And really that child has done nothing wrong. Sexual abuse is abuse of power, that's what it is. Someone stronger than you, and it's not just male on male. There is female on male also. It is the percentages are much smaller, but those that have maybe had an experience at 10 years old by someone that was much older than them, that was female, 8 years old, even 12, 14 years old, still can be, it still is sexual abuse.
I think that's a misconception. A misconception is, that sexual abuse has to be this. It has to be this or that, or it's not sexual abuse. And as mentioned, that sexual abuse there's many different forms. It doesn't have to be the complete act of physical, sexual touching.
And as we're dealing with children, I mean, children do love, whether it's a parent or whether it's a relative, an aunt, uncle, whatever. I mean, a lot of these kids, they do love the person who actually used and abused them, and they're trying to understand why they did what they did to help try and heal their relationship. And this would be a little bit older than the very, very young. But sometimes that in their mind, they're trying to comprehend, they're trying to put all these things together, and it's just the torment over and over, trying to figure out why did you do that? What did I do wrong? What happened? What I could have done differently to have escaped this? What can I do to make it better? Maybe something that I can do that can help that person change. It's all something that a child's trying to process.
And I think that's where I just blocked it out. I got to a point, because you're an innocent child, you know nothing of sex. And then boom, one day goes by, the world becomes very real. What people are after and who they truly are becomes very real. And to deal with that as a child, as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, I mean, even 13, 14 years old, that's a lot to process. And especially process in your own head by yourself because you're too scared to talk to anybody about it. So it just mentally, the easiest thing for me to do was just to put it away and not deal with it. But the subconscious effects of that were drug abuse, sexual depravity.
I want to jump into that real quick while we're right there. Talks about being sexually used or abused by whether it is a male or female can cause a variety of other emotional, psychological problems in an individual. The boys and men, they also often don't recognize the connections between what happened and the problems later in their life, which you're saying, the things that you went through, you didn't really tie that in until much later while you were going through the things you do. And I know at one time, too, you said you had a pretty violent streak going on at one time there. I mean, looking to lash out, cross me and you'll find out, I'm not a little boy anymore. And just that. And I do know people that operate like that too. It's give me a reason and I will show you the man that I am. That mentality gets just ingrained in them because of the abuse that's happened to them, and just extremely violent for some people. But to be used by a sexual object by a more powerful person, male or female, it's just like you said, it's never a good thing, and can cause harm for some people. Never deal with it. So I mean, they're 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. They died at maybe 70 years old, never dealing with the effect of that abuse because they didn't think that there was freedom. Freedom wasn't for them, is what they thought. Right. So that abuser in their mind just abuses that for 70 years, maybe, 60 years, dealing with that abuse over and over in their mind, if they remember that at all, or even subconsciously if they don't, then that torment of why am I this way, why am I doing these things all the time, why do the people have addiction problems that they do sometimes, and they can't get free and they can't find out because it's so buried.
That's it. I was on my way here, the Lord reminded me of it. Brittany and I lived in Nashville, and I had a very bad cocaine addiction, and I spent the majority of our nights wide awake in a bedroom closet with the door shut and with a pistol pointed at the door. That was normal life for us. She sleeps in the bed. I'm scared of whoever coming in and getting me, so I barricade myself in the closet with a pistol pointed at the door, night after night after night.
And you're one of millions and millions of people. Yours can't be the only one unique story out of all that.
And that was the lie. That's the lie from the enemy, is that you're unique in your mess. Nobody's going to understand you, and that leads to the victim mentality. Be a victor, not a victim. I spent my life blaming everybody else. It was because of my dad. It was because of the abuse. It was because this, that, and the other. And all it boiled down to was I wasn't ready to deal with the demons that I was fighting. And the minute that I was, there was no fight. There was no fighting a demon. It was one step, one step. And it was saying, Jesus is Lord. Jesus is King. And there's so much freedom in that. We've got all the programs. I'm not knocking them. They do a lot of great things for people. The 12-step, AA, NA. But I'm not going to sit around a table day after day and claim that I'm an alcoholic that just is choosing not to drink today.
Your identity in that statement.
Right. My identity is I'm a child of God, the creator of all things. Took the garbage from me and dusted me off, picked me up, dusted me off, and here we are today. I'm not going to sit around the table. It's not 12 steps. It's one step. It's, saying, yes, I believe in you, Jesus. You died on a cross for me. You're resurrected from day 3, and you are Lord. And it's that simple. We miss it by 18 inches, from here to here. It's not a brain issue. It's a heart issue.
And I was thinking, as you're talking about that, I said, you had as you were abused, then Satan steps in after that, and he abuses you day after day after day, year after year after that one moment, and he gets his way, and all you did was step in and say, Jesus, to stop the abuse. And he did. At that moment, he stopped the abuse for all those years, to where now you can go out and be an effective weapon for the kingdom of God and help others deal with the abuse that they've dealt with, and be able to get sense of that and just step into the love that. And that's the thing. People talk, okay, so my mom didn't love me, my dad didn't love me because otherwise they wouldn't have abused me this way. God can't love me either. And that's another lie too, because Satan doesn't want you to step into that love that the Father has for you to rescue you from all the abuse that you've gone through.
One of the greatest moments looking back on the night that I went to the church was Todd Hill asked me to close my eyes. It's a very emotional moment for me, like just thinking about it. He said, close your eyes. He said, we'll sit here as long as we've got to. Close your eyes. Go back to that room the very first day it happened. And he said, tell me when you see Jesus. And it was like the second I closed my eyes and I got back in that place, there he was. And his hands were out. He wasn't upset with me. And from that point forward, my life had changed forever. True freedom.
For some here, you may not be the one that's being abused, but you might suspect that someone else has, or you see certain things that shifts in people. One of the recent signs of abuse that you can help recognize maybe and help someone else from being a lifelong, because we haven't even talked about sexual trafficking or human trafficking, and we don't have time for all that today because it goes down that road so far. But and to be sexually trafficked like that, they think that you're in another state. It could be in the same town. It could be in Nortonville that someone could be sexually trafficking that is from Nortonville. But like I said, we don't have to go in. We're not going to go into that today. But some of the behavioral signs are more common. Can include depression. We talked about that. Anxiety, anger, loss of appetite, withdrawal from normal activities. Say somebody loved to do something all the time. Now they can't stand it. They hate it. They won't. They'll scream, yell, throw a fit at a child. Something is definitely going on there that sparked that from one day to the next. Someone getting into substance abuse, self-mutilation is another big one. Fear of certain places or people. You walk into a room and all of a sudden that child, somebody else walks in with you and that child, all of a sudden it just starts really, an extreme thing would be a child would wet its pants, something like that. There is something seriously that has happened there that your red flag should really go through the roof and try and see what's going on. Night sweats, nightmares, thoughts of suicide, also a big one. One of the statistics I read about someone that has been abused, they end up going into a bisexual lifestyle, trying to process all this. The suicide rate is 7 times for that individual, for that male living that life that's been abused. They just don't know what's going on, and it's a push-pull. They don't have any peace. They're not grounded. Sexual acting out. Language that's not age appropriate. All of a sudden, your 6-year-old that's been great before, and you come over and visit, and all of a sudden now it's F this, F that, going off the walls with just this language. It's not normal for a 6-year-old, And there again, some of the outcomes of that, you had already touched on that. PTSD, they think it's just for soldiers. It's not. It's for anyone that's experienced a severe fear, trauma. There's some other things. I won't go into big details of that, but it's not just for soldiers.
Right.
Major depression, anxiety disorders, borderline personality disorder, antisocial, paranoia, dissociation, bulimia, anger, and aggressive behavior. We talked about that before with you at one time, being very
aggressive towards my wife. Aggressive towards anybody. I had to prove, I was the alpha male. It was always a bar fight. Just silly stuff. Thought I was proving to everybody else how tough I was, and the whole time it was all for me. All trying to validate myself.
You know, we was some to fall off into poor self-esteem. We talked about guilt, shame, trying to blame other people for different things. I mean, shifting blame continually, trying to get a rise, I guess, would be maybe accusing a little brother or sister of doing something constantly, trying to get someone else abused in a certain way. I think just a lash out, trying to get it to process that somebody else shares pain with me to maybe bring.
Misery loves company.
Yes. You're talking sleep disturbance like that, couldn't sleep, lack of trust. I mean, I think a lot of us have been there to where we really have a problem trusting people. Yeah. We kind of put that wall, that border, don't cross this line here, or it turns very ugly very quickly. Flashbacks, like I said, not just for soldiers. Substance abuse, we talked about how that really took you off into that realm too, starting at the age that you did with drugs and alcohol. What I think we said about 12 originally.
Yeah, 12.
Really diving off into that, and it wasn't half-hearted, it was full. And it can actually, as people get older, it can, sexual dysfunction, hypersexuality would be another one, really going off the deep end, diving into the sexual realm like that.
That seems to be a large issue with the females being sexually abused, is the hypersexuality, the promiscuity of...
Some in here, even we talked about that before, about the bisexuality. Some people end up into a confused sexual identity over these abuses. They don't know. They think maybe that's just the way that I'm supposed to be then. Somebody found me attractive, so I'm supposed to be attracted to males, or females to females, and things like that. This abuse can set that all up. There are some statistics out there, like I said, that it's not the direction I want to go today with that either. Suicide attempts, again, too, like I said, not just thoughts, but and problems. Like you said, intimate relationships with your wife at the time made very difficult all this trauma that you experienced.
Well, essentially, the wall, I built a wall up, and until the night of my salvation, I was still the 6-year-old boy that was abused. I never, it was like I hadn't really grown mentally. I was still stuck there, and it was, I mean, God bless her. My wife is one of the strongest, determined, God-fearing people that I know, just for the simple fact of she put up with me for so long. And that goes back to, if you're dealing with a wife or husband that has an addiction issue, my wife, she stood in the gap for me. She knew when everybody would tell her, you're stupid for staying with him. Divorce him. Get out while you can. And she would just go home and get on her knees and say, God, I know who he is. She stood in the gap and she said, don't let him go, God. Don't let him go until, my time was right. And it's because it's so easy to just give up on people.
Yeah, like I said, we definitely thank God for her every day. Yeah. So, before winding up here, but before you had talked about forgiveness, and a lot of people don't understand that either. And like I said, I had issues up until a few years ago with forgiveness my whole life over just things, and really just empowering people to continue to torment you over and over and over is what that forgiveness. Yeah, that you never experience peace. That it's always there, just eating at you. But some of this is attempting to understand why is not about forgiveness, but helping someone attempt to understand why is not about encouraging forgiveness either. But forgiveness, for those that don't know or maybe struggle with that, forgiveness is a gift. both to yourself and to that other person. I mean, I realize that's hard for some maybe to understand that. Why should they get a pass?
And again, it's a lie. That's such a lie that, that's where I was. I'll never forgive them. I'll never forgive them. They did this, they did that. And at the end of the day, they weren't losing sleep over it. They weren't drug addicted over it. It was me. So the forgiveness was freedom from them, not for them.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it doesn't mean that, we pick up where we left off and things are great from here on out. I trust you. We're going to be best pals. But, forgiveness doesn't have to look a certain way either. There's people in my life that say I haven't forgiven them, which is totally untrue, but I've forgiven them. It just, it doesn't mean that everything's okay.
The thing about forgiveness is it's really only meaningful and real though when it's given freely and willingly. I can't force you to forgive somebody. You can't force me to forgive somebody, or try and manipulate someone into forgiving. It has to really come from your heart. It's just, Lord, I just forgive them, because what it comes down to is they were a willing participant for Satan to work through to do what they did.
Right. And the worst thing that we can do is put a name with the enemy, put a face with the enemy, because like you said, it's the enemy working through these people. It's not them.
And we don't know, does it make it right if they were abused and they go out to abuse someone else? We would think someone would never do that. I can't say that I know. As complex as we are as people, from person to person to person, you can't pattern everything that everybody should be a cookie cutter. This is what happened, they should act this way. We can't say that. I mean, each person, our experiences are separate to ourselves. But even with that, and for some, this is not going to be it's just not going to be easy for you guys. Not. But there are people that will help you walk through the process. But it's not impossible. You can do this. You can forgive people that have abused you, have tormented things in your life. Whether it's, like I said, we're talking mostly about sexual, but there is physical abuse that is just as traumatizing to some children because of the forms of the severity of the abuse. To emotional abuse is a very real thing too, and torments people. Like I said, I'm not trying to downplay any person that's watching that your experience is not important to you, and it wasn't painful, because I know it was. And it does take courage, just like with you here. Like, it does take courage to acknowledge that you've been abused to someone else, to say that, to come up here today and talk to people. It does take courage to do that, to where at one time you might not have been able to do that.
Right.
But as we're finishing up here, I want you guys to know it is never too late to get help. You can start today. You can make the phone call today. You can text. We do have a number here that, if Emily wants to put that up, it is 1-800-656-HOPE, HOPE, and she'll put that up. And I'm just going to read down through this last couple things here. But if you are an adult dealing with the effects of childhood sexual abuse, please remember that you are not responsible for the abuse that happened to you, and that you're not alone. I mean, like I said, we would be glad to talk with you. Emily's putting the number up now, and you can overcome the effects of this abuse that you have had these experiences on your life, the effects that it's done to you. Like I said, Blake can attest to this by his testimony. And he's just one of thousands of people that have gotten free. And I really wish not only the sports community, all the athletes out there that have been affected by this and got through this would speak up, but also those in Hollywood, things like that, that there are survivors out there and they need to hear your stories too. Also, she has a few links to some websites up there also. They have a lot of really good information on. 1 in 6, I think, is one of them. RAIN is another one, and RACE is another one. And there are books available on 1 in 6. She'll have that link there for you guys to look at. Again, though, like I said, if you're suffering, just give us a call, text. Everything is confidential that we do here. If you want some more resources and you don't want to do it here, we can try and hopefully point you in the right direction. But we ask you guys to tune in next Friday. I believe they're doing Driven to be Free with Emily. And just tune in next week at 3 o'clock. And we thank you for tuning in today and watching. Thank you.